My home is where I want to grow old.
My home means everything to me.
My home is the heart of the family.
Home is beautifully designed.
My home is warm.
My home is where I feel safe.
My home is a place to build memories.
My home is healthy.
My house is carbon neutral.
My home is accessible. My home is affordable.
My home is where I feel relaxed.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our session on practical lessons in crisis management and disaster recovery. A little bit about Anthony Collins Solicitors. We are a social purpose law firm. Our ethos is to improve lives, communities and society, and we specialise across a number of sectors that enable us to do this. So housing is our principal focus, but we also work in local government, health and social care, education, charities and social business. And we also provide services for individuals at crisis points in their lives, so critical illness, major accidents or mental incapacity. Speaking personally, I am Victoria Jardine and I'm a partner at Anthony Collins, specialising in corporate governance. Sorry, would you mind clicking the slide on? I need to get the hang of this better. I'm Victoria Jardine. I'm a partner at Anthony Collins and I specialise in corporate governance for housing associations, charities and not-for-profit organisations. This includes mergers and corporate restructuring, advising boards and executive teams on governance and compliance, and more latterly, collaborations and joint ventures to help organisations achieve more together, which has been a major theme throughout this conference. Next slide, please.
Good morning. I'm Tim Coolican, a partner at Anthony Collins, and I lead our regulatory team. The focus of our work is in relation to the housing and social care sectors. While part of our role is to provide proactive compliance advice, an equally significant part of our role is to support providers in responding to a regulatory crisis. During the pandemic, we've been giving advice to clients on balancing their often competing health and safety obligations. If we could have the next slide, please, and Vic will outline the key points that we intend to cover.
Thanks, Tim. So Tim and I are together going to talk probably for about half an hour, maybe a little bit over, about where we see operational risks arising for housing associations. This is a very different landscape to that of 6 months ago, so it's really important that housing providers are alert to the very unique set of risks that you now face. We'll discuss what good looks like when you're dealing with a crisis, and this is combined learning from many sources, and hopefully it's going to chime really well with your own experiences. And we're then going to apply this to a disaster situation. So what do you need to do to make sure you're managing it? And more importantly, you're seen to be managing it as possible. And then finally, we'll be answering any of your questions that you have on disaster management and responding to a crisis. So please do use the question and answer function to post these throughout the talk. Any examples as well that you've got of things that you've seen done well or done badly in relation to crisis management. We'll pick up as many of those as we can at the end. So I'm now going to hand over to Tim, who's going to explore how we manage risk in a changing world. Next slide, please.
If we could have the next slide, please. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant effect in shaping the risks faced by providers, bringing challenges both in terms of minimising risks and the ability to respond in the event of a crisis. The most recent survey conducted by the regulator on operational response has just closed and the results are still awaited. However, the report at the end of July still clearly indicated that most providers were encountering some difficulties in completing statutory safety compliance checks, and a significant number still report material backlogs. Some providers will clearly have been dealing already with the impact of local lockdowns. The news of recent days appears to indicate that there is a significant increase in COVID cases nationally. While we may not see a second national lockdown, it appears likely that providers will be faced with renewed challenges. For example, the vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable may not presently have the formal recognition given under the shielding scheme, but many in those categories will be clear that risks to them associated with infection have not changed and may well react accordingly as they see local and national infection levels rise. As a result, providers should plan on the basis that access will become increasingly problematic. Many providers will have been able to identify a pattern where access was a problem in the first wave, and now may have a reasonable idea where access will be challenging in the event of either increased restrictions or increasing nervousness on the part of the public. As a result, it may be sensible to try and anticipate where problems could arise and, where possible, start the process of gaining access even earlier than usual. At the same time, the pandemic may have created other areas of heightened vulnerability. One particular concern as we face a possible second wave is the well-being and mental health of staff. Employees at all levels appear to have responded phenomenally well in responding to the crisis, establishing new ways of working and demonstrating that in many ways they can work just as effectively. However, whether in a senior management role or undertaking critical frontline tasks, there remains a real risk of burnout, especially if staff have to face similar challenges again, just as some were expecting things to return to some form of normality. There may be particular challenges in relation to frontline staff. With more remote approaches to working, normal support mechanisms and supervision may not be in place, making it more likely that warning signs may be missed. In particular, for those providers providing care and support to vulnerable adults, there may be a need to ensure that the signs of a potential safeguarding crisis are not being mixed. In that context, it's important to be aware that mental health was already a key health and safety executive target, with most legal experts anticipating that we will first see the first prosecution by the HSE relating to the management of stress and mental health at work. While there will be a pragmatic view taken in relation to the urgent steps taken to respond to the lockdown and ongoing restrictions, if changed working patterns become long-term, organisations must ensure that they have effective support processes in place to deal with both the impact on staff responding to the crisis and the impact of long-term home working. In a similar way, the focus on responding to the challenges of the pandemic may have distracted from other day-to-day risks. In focusing on risk assessments relating to COVID, could supervision of a repairs team working at height fail to spot potentially serious health and safety breaches? Finally, one issue that we will look at in more detail later is whether responding to a serious incident has now been made more challenging. At this stage, we wanted to review the responses of the key regulators, starting with the Health and Safety Executive. As with almost all regulators, they have taken a broadly pragmatic and supportive approach. However, their approach has developed over the months and is likely to continue to develop in time as more significant long-term COVID-related cases develop. As the significance of the pandemic has become clearer, they've taken an increasingly active role in policing organisations' response to COVID-19. However, their approach appears to recognise that health and safety legislation was not written with COVID-19 in mind, and they've taken a sympathetic approach to this conundrum. During lockdown, there was a clear recognition that there was a need to balance competing safety risks. While not all providers may have welcomed the stance taken by the Health and Safety Executive, the executive supported a risk-based approach to the need to complete gas safety checks, and also took a similarly pragmatic view about the completion of thorough examinations for lifting equipment. As a wide range of businesses have returned to more normal patterns of work, the Health and Safety Executive have been at pains to emphasise their role in providing support and guidance to ensure compliance with COVID secure. However, as time has gone by, and arguably under political and public pressure, the tone of their public statements has been increasingly to refer to the potential for enforcement action, where they uncover significant breaches or their guidance is ignored. Their public statement appears to suggest that they will not jump straight to the step of prosecution where breaches are identified, and instead will only pursue that option where organisations fail to follow the directions of a formal improvement or prohibition notice. You may have read in this morning's news that the Department for Work and Pensions have been served with a notice of contravention for breaches of COVID guidance at an office in Leeds. Notices of contravention are the lowest level of formal intervention, in effect notifying an organisation of a breach and advising on the steps required to remedy it. But it comes along with an invoice from the Health and Safety Executive for the time spent investigating and advising on the issue. and for many organisations, simply being on the front page of the BBC website in relation to a safety-related breach would amount to a crisis in itself. On reading this news, 2 points struck me. The first was that the breaches appeared to relate to staff collaborating in close proximity, arguably more the result of failing to ensure that staff were following internal guidance than a failure to plan, which reinforces the need not only to plan effectively, but to train staff in relation to what is required, and then to ensure that they are complying. The second point was that the issues came to the attention of the Health and Safety Executive as a result of a disgruntled employee contacting their helpline, apparently having felt under pressure to return to the office. This reinforces another key point on which we've advised organisations returning to the office, namely the importance of effective communication to ensure that concerns of staff are listened to and acted upon. Firstly, so that staff are more likely to agree to return. And secondly, that if complaints are raised, organisations will be in a position to show that effective measures are in place, they've listened to staff and taken effective measures in response. Up from a compliance notice, the next level of enforcement action from the HSE would be to issue a formal enforcement notice. Whilst we don't have the complete picture, we do know that their investigations into the Leicester textile industry resulted in at least 9 enforcement notices, of which 3 related to failure to protect employees from exposure to COVID. The Health and Safety Executive have made very clear that they will be conducting spot checks, primarily targeting COVID secure compliance. Primarily, they are targeting high-risk areas, but we can expect that to widen over time. And organisations will need to ensure that they don't simply pass the check in relation to COVID with flying colours, only to be picked up in relation to unrelated safety obligations. And that hopefully emphasises my final point on this slide, that their expectations in relation to day-to-day health and safety risk remain unchanged. At that point, could I ask for the next slide? Thank you. At the start of the pandemic, the Care Quality Commission made equally supportive comments about the importance of taking a supportive and pragmatic approach. Despite health and social care being at the very front line of the pandemic, the CQC have arguably taken a very low-profile approach. All routine inspections had been suspended, with inspections only taking place in response to significant concerns. To provide a degree of regulatory oversight, the CQC introduced their emergency support framework, with telephone calls made by inspectors to talk through points of concern to the CQC or providers. That has provided a potentially useful platform for providers facing impossible challenges, where competing health and safety and care quality obligations appear to collide. While the CQC may not have been able to formally approve providers' responses, having the fingerprints of a regulator on decisions of that kind can offer a degree of support in the event of a later challenge, and it's an approach that we would encourage all sectors, including the housing sector, to adopt. It has been our experience that local authority safeguarding and commissioning teams have taken a more active role in policing COVID-related risks. However, the CQC have made clear that they propose to increase their inspection process if things return to normal, with the promise that all providers will have some form of regulatory visit before March 2021. Given their frontline role, the health and social care sector has been at the front of the debate about the potential for civil claims from employees and those being supported who have contracted COVID. The uncertainty around the prospects for successful claims has resulted in a contraction of the insurance market. In particular, residential care providers are increasingly facing withdrawal of cover for public liability claims, with a potential financial black hole facing those with a significant number of infections in any second wave. In some cases, the size of the potential shortfall, combined with the uncertain picture, would be enough to cause providers to withdraw from providing care services, unless and until either the government agreed to provide indemnity in relation to COVID-related claims in the care sector, as they have in the health service, or the insurance market is prepared to recommence cover. Until that is resolved, the issue creates a very real risk of financial crisis for those providing care services, which now need careful consideration. Before I hand back to Vic to look at the expectations of the regulator for social housing, There is one common point that providers should consider as we face a potential increase in COVID cases nationally. There is undoubtedly a degree of understanding from regulators and the public that organisations were facing an unprecedented set of circumstances as we entered lockdown in March. In the event of a second wave, the expectation is far more likely to be that everyone knew that it was coming and should have been ready and prepared. Could we have the next slide, and I'll hand back to Vic.
Thank you very much, Tim. So before we go any further, can I just remind you please to put any comments or questions that you might have into the questions box and send them through to us. And we're hopefully going to allow some time at the end to answer those. So many of us will have heard Fiona McGregor speak at length about the response of the regulated housing sector to the COVID crisis. And generally, this has been extremely positive. Housing associations reacted sensibly and proportionately when lockdown began. And throughout the week, we've heard uplifting and encouraging stories of heroic efforts to keep core services going, not just for the most vulnerable members of our communities, but for all tenants and residents. To allow housing associations to focus first and foremost on protecting residents and staff and keeping core services going, the regulator, in their words, got out of the road and adopted a pragmatic light touch approach to regulation. However, in Fiona's own words, light touch does not mean no regulation. And since May, the regulator has quietly upped the ante when it comes to compliance. Anything that causes a risk of serious detriment to customers or staff will be treated with the utmost seriousness. And there was also a clear steer from Fiona McGregor earlier this week when she explained that the regulator may be revisiting what it means by serious detriment in the light of the outcomes of the Building Safety Review and the forthcoming Housing White Paper, alongside the introduction of the new Ombudsman. We've therefore seen a resumption of regulatory engagement over the last few months, focusing on governance, risk management, financial resilience, stress testing and contingency planning, and also RP's capacity to manage, deliver and supervise repairs and major works. The backdrop to the future, however, is one of months and possibly years of local and, it is possible we will still have national periodic lockdowns. And the regulator's concerns about housing associations' ability to manage these effectively, particularly if their services span different geographic areas. So what happens if half your staff are locked down in one area, and how will you continue to deliver services effectively? I think the regulator is also concerned that the get things done approach may have equated to some corner cutting on governance. And so the onus will be on RPs who continue temporary governance arrangements into permanent ones to demonstrate how these reflect good and strong governance. The regulator continues its programme of virtual IDAs and has made it clear that every grading pre-COVID comes with a strong health warning unless and until the regulator can satisfy itself that it remains justified. So if you could have the next slide, please. Tim, I think I'm going to hand back to you at this point.
So we now want to look at what good looks like in a crisis. And the first point is the importance of being prepared. Since joining Anthony Collins, I've given a number of presentations on crisis management. One key message has always been to try and anticipate the unexpected. I have to accept that at that point, I'd not in any way anticipated that we would all be facing exactly that and rapidly reacting to the challenges of COVID-19. We agreed to give this presentation soon after lockdown started, with the broad theme that providers needed to prepare to respond to a significant safety or other related crisis, possibly while still dealing with the impact of the pandemic. Not long after, the tragic events of the fatal crane collapse in East London occurred, providing a very clear example of the point that we were trying to make. While the natural reaction to such tragic events is to feel sympathy for those involved, there is also a need to always consider what your organisation would do if faced with such an incident. In order to be fully prepared, it's necessary to consider the worst case scenarios, the steps that would have been taken to mitigate the risks of such scenarios occurring, and if such a scenario arose, how your organisation would respond. In order to be properly prepared, it's essential to consider as far as possible what new risks have arisen, and what new challenges the pandemic will create. It's also necessary to consider how the pandemic has affected existing and established risks faced by providers. For example, providers should consider how far safety risks have changed due to the pandemic, perhaps with more people at home and a potential change in behaviour, perhaps leading to corridors and communal areas being more cluttered, perhaps resident smoking in different areas, and creating new fire risk aspects. The progress made to reduce the backlog of compliance checks will no doubt reassure many that those risks are reducing, but the potential for a second wave is likely to reverse that progress. While the overall position in relation to emergency repairs appears to be more positive, there's also a need to be cautious about whether all residents would have been prepared to report potentially dangerous situations. Crisis management plans and procedures will also need to be thoroughly reviewed to ensure that new ways of working and restrictions do not impact upon the response to a crisis. There is one certainty, that a crisis will never develop just at the point when you're ready to deal with it. With increased remote working, there may be fewer employees present at the site of a safety-related incident. Has that been taken into account in considering whether effective action can be taken to get staff, residents, and members of the public away from danger and seek assistance from the emergency services? Despite remote working arrangements, in most crises, one key issue is to get sufficient experienced members of staff to the site, or at least in a location where they can coordinate the organisation's response and liaise with the emergency services. While Microsoft Teams and Zoom have greatly enhanced the ability to communicate, they are unlikely to be as useful in an emergency response. In many cases we've been involved in, where there's been criticism of the response, it has involved an inability to get someone to the site who can act as an effective point of contact. Often that arises when the individual responsible cannot be located, with someone else stepping in at short notice and trying to deal with issues remotely, but failing to understand all of the complexities and failing to grasp what is required. The question that needs to be asked is whether all key members of staff you expect to be able to respond are able to do so, whether that's because of self-isolation, someone unexpectedly being stuck in quarantine, or because of some form of lockdown. Emergency response plans will therefore need to be reviewed to ensure that there is an effective and robust identification of deputies, to ensure sufficient trained and experienced members of staff are in a position to attend. I will return later to the importance of training, but one key point is to ensure that those attending have a clear understanding of lines of communication, not only to ensure an effective operational response, but also to ensure that the senior leadership team are well briefed and are ready to implement a communication plan, able to anticipate press interest and to inform and update all relevant partners and regulators. In the same way, careful planning is required to ensure that access can be obtained to key documentation, either to assist in the immediate response or in the following days in response to requests from investigators. Even before the challenges of COVID, we've seen organisations struggle to locate and provide key documents required. Where your crisis response relies upon the assistance of external support, it may be wise to check that up-to-date contact details are available and that key partners are in a position to respond. For example, where the emergency response requires support from technical experts, what is their present resilience and capability? Legal support may be required to advise on the commencement of an internal investigation or to advise on the information provided to external investigators. PR consultants may be required to assist in framing public communications. In all cases, it's too late to find that the contact details have changed as a result of home working, and now is the time to ensure that emergency contact lists have been updated and made available to all relevant staff. Contingency plans to provide emergency shelter and longer-term accommodation may also need to be reviewed. What was suitable pre-COVID may no longer be appropriate or even available. Providers should also ensure that their crisis management plan looks past the immediate response and considers what will be needed in the medium and long term. Another key point is to consider the ongoing support that will be provided to residents and staff members involved in the incident. Residents are likely to want clear and transparent answers as to why the incident occurred, and the steps that the provider is taking, for example, when repairs will be made to a building. Returning to one of the key points raised earlier about the importance of mental health, one key issue in the aftermath of a crisis will be to ensure effective ongoing support for your employees involved. Once again, that may be more challenging with changed working patterns, making it harder to spot the signs that someone who claims to be fine isn't, and to provide ongoing reassurance and support. Could we have the next slide, please? Perhaps the most critical aspect of preparing for a crisis is practice. Confidence on the part of key staff will be critical to the effectiveness of your response. If your key staff don't know what to expect, they cannot be expected to respond in a calm, professional, and reassuring way. In turn, that is likely to lose confidence and credibility with investigators, residents, and the staff on the ground. All staff who may be involved in a safety-related incident must have effective training so that they understand and can implement the emergency plan. In particular, those who are expected to lead the response in the event of a crisis need regular training, which must include the changes that have been made in response to the pandemic, what expectations there are around attendance at the scene, and to ensure that they understand the key lines of communication. Once trained, staff need to be given the opportunity to practice in as realistic a situation as possible. One example is a tabletop exercise, talking the team through a developing scenario. It can also be sensible to speak to the local emergency services to understand what would best assist them if a serious incident occurred. For example, what information and support would they require, and whether this has changed in the light of the pandemic. Simply going through that exercise will give staff greater confidence that they know how to respond and what to expect. It should also iron out flaws in the process, as everyone involved is forced to actively consider how an incident would actually unfold. Ultimately, a good or excellent response to a crisis will come down to ensuring that an organisation has a positive safety culture in which there is a constant focus on trying to make improvements, anticipating areas of risk, and listening to and responding to concerns from residents and the workforce. Responsibility for a positive culture clearly rests with the leadership of the organisation, and if we can have the next slide, Vic will consider in more detail preparation for a crisis from a governance perspective.
Thank you, Tim. So we heard Tim talk there about the importance of being prepared and the importance of testing this preparedness. But what does this mean in practice from a governance perspective? We've had many conversations throughout the COVID crisis with housing associations and housing providers up and down the country and across the sector, individually and collectively in groups. And from those, our view as to what best practice looks like is as follows. The first relates to your risk register and the importance of having a risk register, which is a live risk register. So as with all living things, visit it often, keep it well watered, give it plenty of light, and don't shut it in a drawer and forget about it. You need to be revising it constantly to keep abreast of emerging and retreating risks. And you need to keep an open mind to things that might not on the face of it seem like risks, but are nonetheless. So 9 months ago, who would have thought we would have gone from a standing start to full lockdown within 4 weeks? But your gaze needs to take in the local, so local spikes and lockdowns, the national, Brexit and the end of furlough that's looming, and also the global potentially, so the US elections in November. All of these could, directly and indirectly, to a greater or lesser degree, add stress to your business. It's the world's most obvious statement, but you should have a risk management strategy that's aligned with the risks that you have to manage. So it's not surprising that no one had a strategy for major home working 7 months ago or an IT strategy to match, but now almost everybody does. Similarly, how would you identify what you need in a crisis and go about sourcing it? So PPE equipment, for example. Brexit is still an imminent and very serious risk with all the issues that's going to bring for housing associations and providers of housing, scarcity of resource, staff and supplies, etc. You need to make sure that your risk management strategy takes all of this into account. You need to step up your stress testing and you need to redo it every time a new material risk emerges or an existing one changes its priority. It's the compound effect of risk upon risk that will generally do for you, not a single event. So how are you anticipating, for example, and October, which could very well bring a further extension on the restriction on evictions, alongside likely local lockdowns across the country, alongside the end of furlough in October and potential mass redundancies. In non-COVID news, the introduction of the new right to shared ownership, which now seems to have been implemented with immediate effect, will impact on lenders' willingness to accept new build as security and therefore your strength of security covenant. The full repairing obligations for the property remain with the RP, as I understand it, so you need to be accommodating this in your financial projections, which potentially means that you need to be stress testing your future development plans. As well as risk management strategy, of course, you need a really good and effective crisis management strategy and procedure, as Tim explained. In a crisis, everyone needs to know what their role is and what their focus is, and be absolutely clear how this fits in with everyone around them. So for boards, your role is not to roll up your sleeves and get stuck into this, but your role is strategic and to hold and be accountable for the operational side of things getting done. Executives are responsible for the implementation of strategy and operational management and should have the space and support to do so. One of the most cited lessons that we've heard throughout the COVID crisis is the need for better and better and better communication all the time, but especially during a crisis. So your organisation needs to be able to speak with one voice, both internally and externally. You need to be proactive in a crisis, which is really challenging when you are yourself on the back foot with things. But your people, your customers, your staff, your stakeholders should really only ever hear bad news about your organisation from you directly, so you can control the message and directly influence what their response is to it. In the absence of a clear narrative from the centre, as we know, people will invent their own. So you need to come up with a communication strategy which is robust and also a delivery strategy for that. And finally, in a crisis, you can't afford to have tunnel vision. You need to keep your peripheral vision so you can spot left field risks as they emerge. We have the next slide, please. So distilling this down into what a response to a crisis looks like from a governance perspective. You should immediately implement the crisis management procedure that we've talked about on the previous slides. And this needs to be absolutely clear about who's in charge and what they're in charge of, what everybody's role is, and for those whose role is not an active one in managing the crisis situation, how they can support those that are without getting in the way. You need to take immediate steps to make sure that your customers and staff are protected, and then you need to manage the communication side of things and engage with appropriate stakeholders and external agencies. You need to be absolutely certain what the central message is at any given time and who is responsible for communicating it, and that this is being done effectively. The board needs to be clear on its role, and the executive team needs to be clear on their role. So the board makes sure appropriate responses are made available to those who need them as they need them to deal with the crisis. And this includes freeing people up to focus on what they need to focus on. The board's also responsible for overseeing and monitoring the risk register and making sure that the regulator and other stakeholders are kept informed. The executive, on the other hand, is responsible for operational delivery and management of the crisis. They must be empowered to take swift and decisive actions on the ground, but this must be tempered by appropriate accountability to the board for this. Information flow is absolutely critical, and it's often at one end or the other end of the spectrum. Either too much information is flowing around, so critical people spend more time reporting on what they're doing and less time on actually doing it, or there is too little information, so there is insufficient oversight and accountability, particularly up to board level. Ideally, you would decide as part of your crisis management planning what information would need to be supplied to whom, by whom, and how often, so that they have a complete picture of what the problems are that need to be solved, what the plan is for solving them, and how that's being implemented. As an executive team, you can't possibly tell the board everything, so don't try. Pick the business critical information that they need to see and focus on making sure that is effectively delivered. And this also ties in with the need for the board to keep its eye on the bigger picture. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, not losing peripheral vision. Don't let the crisis distract your key attention away from core service delivery and the health and safety of your customers and tenants. Keep on top of your stress testing. I think I've probably laboured that point enough, so I won't mention it again. Could we have the next slide, please? So really, that's the talk bit of our session. We're now open to questions, and please do keep sending them in, because there are some really interesting ones coming up on the line for Tim and I to have a look at. But in terms of the key takeaways for you today, I think the first one is that you need to adapt to the new normal. Life has changed pretty fundamentally in many ways over the past 7 months. Whether those are permanent sticking ones or whether they are temporary for a prolonged period of time, we remain to see whether that's the case. But they're certainly going to continue as we settle into new ways of working and living for the foreseeable future. Sporadic lockdowns, shielding of tenants, for example, general unpredictability. So we have to be light on our toes. We also have to expect the resumption of regulatory expectations, and Tim has talked about the CQC and Health and Safety Executive, and I talked about the Social Housing Regulator. The protection of tenants and employees and staff are at the heart of what you need to be focusing on from a regulatory perspective. Stable and strong finances are also something the regulator of social housing is looking for. And everybody wants to see the resumption of core services and the clearing of backlogs around repairs and maintenance taking a central position within housing association planning. Tim, do you want to talk about the last two?
Yes, thank you. The first point was just to emphasise the importance of preparing, planning and practice. In talking to a colleague about the themes of our presentation, they made the comment that perhaps it was all a little depressing for a Friday. And that is the burden of a regulatory lawyer, that we have to deal with events that no one wants to face and don't expect to arise in their organisation. However, the obvious point is that it's organisations that accept one day a crisis will strike that are more likely to take action to prevent it happening and will be ready to respond in the unfortunate event that it does. The starting point for that preparation must always be on ensuring that all stakeholders are protected, whether that's protecting employees from the impact of stress or the risks associated with COVID, or residents in relation to the risks associated with delayed safety checks or repairs, or simply the increased challenges organisations face in responding to a fresh crisis while dealing with the crisis of the pandemic itself. And at that point, I think we'll turn to some of the questions.
Thank you very much, Tim. So we have a question on the message board from Penny Huggard at Futures. Good afternoon, Penny. And she's explained that the DWP report this morning is really interesting. We've got good risk assessments, training and videos for staff returning to offices. However, we've also recognised the need to work on a culture of compliance, developing good habits and regular reminders. Whether all this will be sufficient, only time will tell. Any thoughts on what we can do to build the level of cooperation needed? Tim, any thoughts on this?
So I was just trying to refresh the screen in relation to the question. Sorry, could you repeat the question again for me?
Yes, so the DWP report this morning is really interesting. We have good risk assessments, training and videos for staff returning to our offices. However, we've also recognised the need to work on a culture of compliance, developing good habits and regular reminders. Any thoughts on what more we can do to build the level of cooperation needed?
The tempting answer is to suggest that it's a need to walk the floor, to check that things are being done. But of course, that is a challenge in relation to the present environment, where we're trying to encourage people not to mingle. I think it's a phenomenally good question, and probably one that I'm struggling to answer very effectively. I think it is simply the normal process of checks and balances in relation to any process, that you need to empower your managers to be policing in a positive and encouraging way the measures that are being put in place, to make sure that your employees really understand and have bought into the reasons for the measures that you're taking, so that they all understand that it's important both for them and the organisation that they comply.
Thanks, Tim. Penny, I hope that's helpful. I think from my perspective, I would say the key word for me in your question is culture. And obviously cultures aren't built overnight. But if the organisation as a whole is leading from the top in demonstrating compliance and generating these good habits and regular reminders, and is visibly doing this, so being seen across the organisation to be adhering to good practice and to share discussions and share forums to explore what they're doing personally on this, then that probably is the starting point. And of course, it's very challenging at the moment as we're doing a lot of things remotely, and when we are gathering together, it's on the basis of limited social distancing. But hopefully it's something that will evolve fairly naturally within your organisation. It sounds like you're off to a really good start.
And just before we move on to the next question, one final point from me, that obviously culture does start right from the very top. And I think boards and senior management teams can contribute to ensuring compliance in relation to these measures by making sure that employees understand that they're genuinely interested in the safety concerns, rather than simply looking at compliance in terms of a statistical checklist approach.
Yeah, that's a very valid point, Tim. So we have another question on the message board here, which are, Tim, what are your top tips for responding to a crisis in an increasingly virtual world? That's an interesting one.
Yes, let me collect my thoughts in relation to that point. I think a number of those issues have probably been addressed during the course of the presentation, but the three key points that I would probably want to draw out. The first is making sure that there are clear and well understood lines of communication, that there's a pre-planned escalation process and agreed methods of communication. The second really is my point in relation to documentation, thinking really carefully about how documents are stored and held, and clearly trying to make sure that we are in a position that they're electronically available and easily shared. And then third, probably coming back to my point in relation to the previous question, trying to make sure that as far as possible, all stakeholders feel that they're being supported by the organisation, because if they feel genuinely supported, they will respond better in a crisis. And in the same way in the previous question, they are much more likely to be self-policing and complying with the procedures that you've put in place.
Thanks, Tim. So let's have a look. What else do we have? A question here. It can sometimes feel difficult to reconcile our general health and safety duties with our new duties relating to coronavirus. How would you advise that we do this? And how can we best document the decisions we've made, for example, to demonstrate compliance to the regulator?
I'm glad somebody asked that, because that's the constant challenge that we've been presented with throughout the pandemic. I think the most obvious point is to start with a very clear risk assessment, taking into account all relevant factors, including the most recent government guidance. Organisations then need to come to a clear, logical conclusion about how they can minimise the overall risk, and then clearly document the decisions that they've come to. Where the result appears to leave an organisation at risk of breaching one obligation or another to prevent a more serious breach, I think, as I indicated earlier, ensure that that's being flagged with the appropriate regulator. And I think the phrase that I would constantly use, try and get as many regulatory fingerprints on the decision making as you possibly can. As time is progressing, we're also able to get a greater understanding of COVID-19, have experienced as to how it's affected our daily working lives. And whilst risk assessment should still form the basis of the decisions, they do need to be kept under review. And in doing so, you shouldn't be afraid to speak to staff and residents who are affected. So, talk to the repairs team in relation to the challenges that they're facing. Can they work properly with the PPE that's required? Try and get as much feedback as possible from tenants. What feedback are the repairs team getting as well? So that you can really assess whether the current measures are working and whether they're practical in the long term. And that can help you ensure that the risk assessment is comprehensive but also realistic. And I suppose almost the point that I could have started with is to remember that the test in relation to health and safety is an obligation generally to do everything that's reasonably practicable. And we've tried to sort of give confidence to organisations all the way through the pandemic that it's highly unlikely that they will face formal regulatory action if they can demonstrate that they've acted in good faith to do the very best that they can in challenging circumstances.
Thanks, Tim. We have another question on the message board here, which says, you've talked about the regulator potentially changing the definition it gives to serious detriment. What do you think they could change it to? Shall I kick this one off, Tim?
Yes, please, if you could.
Yeah, okay. So the answer is that obviously, we've no way of knowing really what the regulator's thinking is on this. It's been alluded to. Fiona talked about it in her talk earlier this week. But since Grenfell, we have, in my view, certainly seen a shift in attitude on the part of the regulator when it comes to serious detriment. So once upon a time, it genuinely did seem to mean the actual death or serious injury of a tenant or an employee or service user. The trigger point then shifted from actual death or serious injury to the significant risk of that happening. But more recently, the bar seems to have been lower still, namely a risk, but not necessarily an imminent or likely risk of death or serious injury. And this has in part been driven by and has driven the disclosure over the past 3 or 4 years of systematic failures in record keeping around health and safety on the part of some RPs, which we know has triggered a number of regulatory downgrades. And obviously the regulator's thinking on this has been evolving as it's been looking at those examples, and we can probably expect it to evolve still further. Tim, do you have any views on that?
Yes, I suppose from a wider regulatory perspective, it does feel that in recent years, the regulator for social housing has perhaps placed a greater focus on statistics rather than substance, perhaps, dare I say it, in relation to the consumer standards. And one thing that we've been advising all the way through the pandemic is that organisation or the regulator in judging organisations will need to take a much more nuanced and balanced view in relation to organisations that are simply trying to do their best for their residents. And therefore, it's not good enough simply to say, your compliance figures aren't up to scratch. You really do need to look in more detail at the underlying reasons why they've not been carried out. And if that was fundamentally in the interests of the residents overall, then that should be taken into account. Now, that does seem to have been accepted by the regulator in response to the COVID pandemic. But if that's good for the pandemic, then equally it should be good for their approach in the longer term. So I can see why you think there may be a stricter test that will be applied. But I do think there's an active debate that needs to be had about whether that is appropriate.
Okay.
There was one question that I have seen on the message board that I wanted to jump in on, with the caveat that I'm not a data protection lawyer. And obviously we've spoken quite a lot during the presentation in relation to the sharing of information between organisations. And the question was whether the Information Commissioner would be supportive of that approach. Certainly in relation to anything which is fundamentally being done to ensure the safety of residents, the broad brush approach would be that the sharing of data is likely to be appropriate. I would in any case want to sort of go back to the detail of the GDPR and the Data Protection Act, give you the precise reasons for that. But in broad terms, where that information is being shared for a necessary purpose, then it is likely that the Information Commissioner would approve that approach.
Okay, yes, of course, we didn't specifically talk about the Information Commissioner in our talk, but the proper use of data is obviously a sort of a core issue for housing associations to manage as part of the risk register. Okay, so another question on the message board. You've referred to the board being responsible, and this is, I think, directed at me. You've referred to the board being responsible for strategy and holding the executive function accountable for the operational management of a crisis response. But this seems very cut and dried. And the answer to that is yes, it is something of a cut and dried response. And of course, the correct answer is that the board and the executive team need to find ways of working together to solve the crisis that mean that they are each drawing on their respective strengths to best effect the benefit of the organisation. But it is also fair to say that traditionally the board's role is strategy and oversight, and the executive's role is the implementation of strategy and operational management. And this remains the general expectation. So the board would be perfectly within its rights to offer support to the management team, but that's very different, obviously, than rolling up their sleeves, stepping in and directing how the organisation specifically responds on the ground to a crisis situation. And of course, the other thing to bear in mind is that the board is generally comprised of individuals that have their own jobs and roles outside the organisation, and who may therefore be facing significant challenges to their own capacity and energy at the time. They may be stretched in many different directions. And so acknowledging that their first priority may not necessarily be to the organisation at all times, and working out how you can draw on board members' expertise and limited capacity to support the crisis management response is really important as well. So I think at the heart of the nexus between the board and the executive when it comes to solving a crisis is playing to your strengths, but spending some time beforehand working out what those strengths are and what the appropriate role is for everyone. So you'll remember that I said it was really important that everybody knew what their role is in a crisis, in solving that crisis. And for some people, it's actively solving it. And for others, it's really getting out of the way and supporting the people who are actively solving it. The same goes for the relationship between the board and the executive team. I would simply say that. Okay. Any more questions on the board, Tim?
There's one which I think is probably something that we could both cover, which was how providers can best use their governance structures to promote a positive health and safety culture. It is one that we've covered a little bit during the course of the presentation. Perhaps if I start, and then if you could contribute with any thoughts of your own. And as indicated in the presentation, a positive culture is possibly one of the most important factors in avoiding a crisis in the first place, and then being ready to respond if a crisis occurs. And as I think I stated in response to sort of one of the earlier points, positive safety culture really starts at the top, making sure that all employees and stakeholders know that the board and senior management genuinely care about safety and don't just see it, as I said before, as a question of compliance or statistics. And I think that's best demonstrated by the board and senior managers showing a genuine interest in safety-related matters, not just relying on supervision and assurance processes for a comfort that a regulator isn't going to come asking awkward questions of the board. And one of the key phrases that we see time and time again in regulatory judgments is often that there was no clear line of sight from the board to safety issues concerned. And while I think you've said earlier, it's not for the board to roll their sleeves up and get directly involved in operational matters. In some way, the board do need to ensure that they can hear what's being said by tenants and by operational staff members on the ground, so that they get a real and meaningful impression of whether those procedures are working.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Tim. And it's not entirely on message with this question, but I was very struck by one of the comments that Fiona McGregor made in her talk earlier this week about the fact that the increasingly complex arrangements that housing associations enter into around the ownership and management of housing stock can sometimes obscure who is responsible for health and safety compliance. And actually, the starting presumption, I think she implied for housing providers, is that you should always assume it's you unless you absolutely know that it's not and take appropriate steps. So really, the culture of ownership of health and safety risk starts at the top and works down. And it's not just the stuff that you can see, it's the stuff that you can't see as well, I suppose, Tim.
No, absolutely agreed.
Yes. Okay, so I think we've got one more question on the message board at the moment. So please do pop some more questions in there if you want. We've still got a few minutes, just over 5 minutes, to answer some further questions. But the question that we've not answered at this stage is a question around how we engage with the regulator during a crisis, because obviously this is extremely important. And the question is, at what point should we be talking to our regulation manager and what should we be saying? And again, I think that it's probably something that Tim has a strong view on, because he is actually the person who is most often involved in crisis response of the two of us. But I would say that probably the basic message here is that the regulator should never hear bad news about you as an organisation from anyone other than you. And in a world of social media, especially Twitter, that means that in a major incident of any kind of description, any nature, probably your third call after you've called the emergency services and called the chair should probably be to your regulation manager to let them know that something's happened. But in making that call, you need to prepare for that beforehand, because what you need to be saying to the regulator at the time is that you're taking appropriate steps to assess the situation and you're taking appropriate immediate action to resolve the situation, and that you will be back in touch with them once you've got a clear overview. And that then buys you the time to go away and have a proper investigation of what's going on and to make sure you're implementing your crisis management plan. If you can reassure the regulator from first contact that you have a tried and tested emergency response plan that you're implementing, and especially that you are ahead of the comms, you should definitely do that. Take the time to do that. And then you'll need to keep the regulator updated periodically so that they're as clear as they can be about what's happened, what you're doing to respond, and what's likely to happen next. I think will be my overarching suggestion from a governance perspective. But Tim, what's it like on the ground?
There's one point that I'm going to disagree with you about, which is you suggested that the regulator should be the third call. Possibly the third call ought to be to the lawyers to check the.
That's a very good point. Fourth call
before contacting the regulator. But certainly, I would put them very, very high up on the checklist in terms of people that need to be informed. And again, I think that applies whether we're talking about the regulator for social housing or whether we're talking about the HSE or the Care Quality Commission. There are probably nuances between those regulators and also other regulators that may be relevant for some providers, including the Charity Commission or the Information Commissioner's Office. But your key point, which is that you never want the regulator to be hearing bad news from someone else, is absolutely right. And therefore, I think that's why you need to be calling the lawyers first, just to get that sense check in relation to, is this something that needs to go to the regulator? What is it that the regulator wants to hear? And most often that, is your point. We're in control. We're taking steps to address it. And therefore, actually, at the same time that you're telling them there's a problem, you are giving them reassurance that the problem is being addressed, so that they don't panic into thinking it's something they need to take greater control of.
Yeah, absolutely right, Tim. And you're absolutely right about phoning the lawyers, of course.
Shameless plug.
I'd also say that first contact with the regulator is really important, but every single subsequent contact thereafter is equally important. And so when you're talking to the regulator, being absolutely clear as to when you will be back in touch with them again and what you'll be hoping to say to them at that point is really critical. And then keeping to any timetables or deadlines that you agree with them. It's very easy to overlook things in a crisis, but as is absolutely natural, if you've told the regulator you're going to come back to them at a certain point and then you don't, they will wonder why. And that might cause more problems further down the line. So, on the front foot with the regulator, be more expansive than you need to be potentially. But Tim's absolutely right. Work out what it is that you're planning to say to the regulator before you make that call. It is a very important one. So, Tim, is there anything else on the message board?
I'm not sure.
Have we answered everybody's questions?
I think we
crisis management. Excellent.
Covered all of those questions.
I suppose probably then we are about 60 seconds ahead of where we thought we would be at this point. But that means you get an extra 60 seconds of lunch before your next session. We really hope that you found this session helpful, useful. Please do provide feedback. It always helps. And you have our contact details on the slides should you want to follow up on any of the issues that we've talked about today. So we wish you a very good rest of the conference and we hope to hear from you. Thank you very much.